Welcome to level 17 out of 31 levels of the 613 degrees or rungs on Jacob's ladder. In regards to the 7 deadly sins, it is also important to not let the 7 deadly sins dwell in your land, not to marry the 7 deadly sins, and not to seek peace with the 7 deadly sins. To allow 7 deadly sins to dwell in land is to allow them to reside. A land is a metaphor for a state of consciousness. When we move from the land of Egypt to the land of Israel, we are growing our state of consciousness from a narrow-minded consciousness to an expanded-minded consciousness. So once we reach the spiritual land of Israel, it is good to not allow any of the 7 deadly sins to reside in one's consciousness or spiritual land. It is also good to not marry any of the 7 deadly sins. To marry is to surround oneself with one of the 7 deadly sins. An example of this would be to surround oneself with pride. It would be to always think one is better than everyone else and everything that person does is superior to others. This is called marrying pride. So it is good to not even let pride reside or dwell in land, and especially not marry pride. Lastly, it is good to not seek peace with 7 deadly sins. To seek peace with 7 deadly sins is to search and settle with any of the 7 deadly sins. An example of this would be to accept pride or greed as a suitable sin and be content and okay with pride and greed residing. It is appropriate to not hate a friend or hate an enemy. Hate is a force of repulsion or a pushing force. Love is a force of attraction or a pulling force. So a friendship is a very special bond with another and should be cherished. One should do their best to not push away friends and keep them close. The same goes for enemies. An enemy is someone who is spiritually distant from a person. It is good practice to not increase the distance between two people by showing greater hatred. A person should not fear their enemy and should try to attack their enemy with love, trying best to create a friendship out of a relationship with an enemy. When one attacks with love, they overcome fear, bringing their enemy closer to a friend. It is good to not fear doubt or uncertainty. A situation is what a person makes of it. If a person has doubt and uncertainty in their mind, then an enemy will remain an enemy. One must be certain and remove doubt that their attack of love will have a positive effect, or else, if doubt settles in, the attack of love might result in futility. One should also be certain that God's plan is good and everything that happens for a reason. One should remove doubt in one's mind and always believe and have faith that God's plan is just and good. One should not forget the dangers of doubt and uncertainty, which causes a person to lose faith and give in to hate. If a person doesn't get their way sometimes, doubt and uncertainty slips in their mind and they can fall into a careless and negligent state of mind, causing negativity on self and others. A person should not rid themselves or refrain themselves from necessities and essential needs. For instance, a person needs food, sex, clothes, a family, and money, and many other essentials to survive and be satisfied. As long as these desires are not worshipped greedily, they are acceptable. Blasphemy, false promises, taking God's name in vain, profaning God, and trying or testing God is looked down upon. To blaspheme God is to devalue God in one's thoughts. To make a false promise is to make a promise intentionally that one knows they cannot keep. To take God's name in vain is to devalue God in one's feelings or emotions. To profane God is to devalue God in one's actions. And to try or test God is to question His goodness and deny His plan. So in terms of devaluing God, to blaspheme is in thought, take God's name in vain is in emotion, and to profane is in action. An example of this is to think, feel, and behave like God is insignificant and worthless and does not deserve one's praise and reverence. It is also important to not break altars and pillars of God. As previously mentioned, altars are positive thoughts and thinking of God, and pillars are positive support systems of God. An example of breaking God's altar is to allow anger to exist. Anger is mild rage and wrath. Another extreme example is to allow anger to linger and turn into wrath, which is extreme rage and anger. Patience is a pillar of God that prevents anger and wrath from manifesting and prevents breaking God's altar.